the Toronto Star. I'm Saba Itazaz, and this matters. Last year was Canada's racial reckoning, a challenge to Canada's self-image of multiculturalism and racial harmony.
Indeed, only 13% report that they feel like the rest of the country sees them as fully Canadian.
My son was attending school and a kid in his class had told him that he had the coronavirus because he was Chinese.
The Canadian government is facing pressure to declare a national day of mourning after the bodies of 215 children were found in British Columbia.
Why don't we ever think of Canada? This is a country where a cultural genocide of Indigenous population went on till the 1990s.
We often tend to make comparisons to our American neighbors and feel a little smug when it comes to racism, among other things. But against a backdrop of BLM, the pandemic's disproportionate impact on the racialized, and the horrific reminders of Canada's legacy of residential schools, many have started asking whether we truly are any different, or maybe racism is something we just don't talk about. That has been made exceptionally clear during this federal election campaign. Many say race wasn't really a top-of-the-mind issue until last week's federal leaders' debates, and even then it remained surface level without getting into what actually is or isn't on party platforms to tackle systemic racism. So what exactly are Canada's electoral candidates saying on how their party will address racism beyond just the reactionary statements and controversies? The Star's Ottawa-based political reporter Raisa Patel joins me now to explain. Hello, Raisa. Welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be here.
I want to start off with a bit of a throwback to the 2019 election campaign. It was around this time 2 years ago when the blackface controversy erupted and race sort of became the running theme. Can you take us back a little bit?
Yeah, it's very interesting that we're having this conversation this week because if we go back to 2019, it was at the end of this very week that we first saw those images of Justin Trudeau painting his face brown. And then suddenly we started to see more images of him engaging in blackface as well. And it was like a really interesting time for Canadian politics to grapple with these issues. You had this leader who didn't divulge that he had done this himself. It had to be exposed by the media, and he wasn't, immediately forthcoming about every single instance in which he had been documented to be engaging in these acts. And so it just really created this question of, who are our politicians when they say one thing about equality and racism and discrimination, but their personal beliefs or their history or their current actions kind of contradict that. What does that mean and who can you trust? And so 2 years ago, the big election question was, is this going to affect Justin Trudeau? Will he get reelected? He did. And here we are today sort of grappling with these issues of racism and action and accountability again.
Right, still grappling, it seems, right in the middle of a snap election, and after a time that has been quite brutal when it comes to racism and discrimination. Can you talk a little bit about what the last year and a half has been like for racialized communities? And has the conversation on race moved beyond the reactionary to the proactive in any way?
So I think brutal really is the right word for it. So if we kind of go back to late spring, early summer of 2020, we saw this huge reckoning over anti-Black racism in Canada after the death of George Floyd. The ripple effect was really felt in many corners of this country, not just in politics, but in other spheres as well. And it led to political parties and institutions like the RCMP to grapple with whether systemic racism existed in their ranks. There was a lot of hesitancy in admitting that, but newsflash, it does exist. And while this is an entirely separate issue, police brutality facing Indigenous communities started to become a bigger issue. And then if we kind of fast forward a bit to this year, we saw a similar thing with this big reckoning when it came to the truly horrific legacy of residential schools in this country. And in both cases, if we kind of go back to the aftermath of George Floyd and with residential schools this year, the rhetoric was kind of the same from politicians. We need to do better. We need justice. We want accountability. We want healing. And then you add on top of that, a series of violent Islamophobic attacks. There was a killing outside a mosque, the London attack, a spate of other incidents. I think it really made Canadians and politicians take stock of the country they live in. But your question is exactly right. There's a lot of focus on nice, placating words in the aftermath of those incidents. And the election kind of stopped some of the action we might have seen on these issues. But now the question will be, are we going to finally see some targeted action after September 20th?
And right. And as you say, many advocates are also saying that addressing racism and its root causes actually hasn't moved quite beyond the surface level. So, what's been the general conversation around this during the campaign so far? Have the party leaders been talking about the rise in hate and racism in Canada? What have they been saying? I do understand there was a fair bit of activity over the weekend.
Yes, we'll get into this more deeply when we talk about specific platform pledges. But in terms of, leaders going out there and talking about these things, it mostly comes up when leaders are asked outright about racism at their press conferences. It's not like they're offering up pledges and announcements by themselves. It doesn't seem to be something that they're actively going out there to talk about with real purpose behind it. They're not really projecting this assurance that this is an issue that they're seized with, but specifically to members of the public who aren't reading their platforms or watching press conferences. If you're part of the Canadian population who is really plugged into that sort of thing, and not everybody is, then maybe you disagree with what I'm saying and you'd say, well, I've heard them talk about it a little bit here and there, or it's in the platform. So there really does seem to be this gap between, policy commitments and actual communication to Canadians. You referenced this weekend, it took relatively late into the campaign for Liberal leader Justin Trudeau to get out there and really materially address these issues. But on September 10th, he held a rally in North York at a Paramount Fine Foods restaurant where he did address the crowd there who were, mostly racialized Canadians. He said there's more that we have to do. He acknowledged that hatred exists online and in real life, and people in this country are afraid to exist in this country, and mentioned some of the steps that he hopes to tackle about hate online and in the real world. But, why is this coming up in the final days of the campaign is another question.
And like you mentioned, sometimes it just comes up when they're asked about it, not as an issue of focus. Before I get into the platforms, I do want to touch on the debates, the English debates quickly, because that's a part of it. How was racism and discrimination raised during the debate?
Came up a couple times, again, not in a very significant way. There was, of course, emphasis on addressing reconciliation and Indigenous issues as there were in other debates. But that, of course, is a separate issue. It's not the same as systemic racism in all cases. The way that racism and discrimination really reared its head in this debate last Thursday was that the moderator asked a question about Bill 21, which is Quebec's secularism law, and that law bans some civil servants from wearing religious symbols or garb. And there's many who believe that that law is discriminatory. And so a question about that law was directed to Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet. And it turned into a bit of a situation where Blanchet felt the moderator was painting all Quebecers as racist. That sort of blew up a little bit. Trudeau and O'Toole, in the aftermath of the debate, found the question to be unfair. Singh felt that singling out Quebec as racist was overall unhelpful to the wider discussion about systemic racism in Canada. The only leader actually to really challenge Blanchet during that exchange was Green Party leader Annamie Paul. She had that quote where she invited the Bloc leader to get educated about systemic discrimination. And while I think we can all agree that talking about that law is important, the way that that conversation and narrative evolved and was politicized took us away from the very real problems of racism and discrimination being faced in this country.
We'll be right back. I was also reading Shri Paradkar's recent column on this for The Star, and she also mentions how no one really spoke the words anti-Black racism, Islamophobia, or anti-Semitism. And once again, the component around racism boiled down to a reactionary stance. What does that say to you about just how the issue of racism has emerged in this campaign?
I think it just sort of comes back to this focus on platforms and less so communication with the public. Like if you go back and you look at the platforms, it's in most of them, not all of them, it's baked in there, it's in there. But if you were to ask, the average Canadian, what have you heard about it from leaders? Is this an issue that matters to them or to you? I think that would be a lot more murky.
All right, so let's get into the platforms so the average Canadian can understand what the major policy points are for these parties. Let's start with the Liberals. What are the major points to tackle racism on their platform?
So the Liberals, in some respects, they're lucky. They were the party that convened the national summits on Islamophobia and anti-Semitism earlier this summer. And there were a lot of recommendations that came out of that. And so their platform offers up a national action plan on combating hate that's directly influenced by the anti-Semitism and Islamophobia summits. It's promising to present that plan by 2022 as part of a renewed anti-racism strategy. Interestingly, the Liberals introduced Bill C-36 earlier this year, which aimed to restrict online hate speech. But that legislation never passed first reading in the House of Commons. So they're promising now to reintroduce legislation within the first 100 days if they form government to tackle online hate, including making social media platforms accountable for the content that they host. And they also have some points on justice system reform. They want to reform mandatory minimum sentences. They want to address systemic discrimination and overrepresentation in the criminal justice system, again, within their first 100 days. So there are a bunch of things that they were seized with before the election that kind of fell off the table. And now is going to be the time to see whether they follow through.
What about the conservative platform, Raisa? As I understand, the words racism or Islamophobia aren't even on their platform. What does that kind of messaging convey? And then what is on their platform on this front then?
So the fact that the conservative platform doesn't include words like racism, Black Canadians, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, that was something that got quite a bit of attention at the start of the campaign. The joke was even made that the word puppy appears in the platform in terms of animal welfare, but racism doesn't. Aaron O'Toole was asked specifically about that. And, he says that he's unequivocally against racism and wants to see recovery for all Canadians after the pandemic. But it's still something that those words aren't in the platform. Very interestingly, what the Tories do is they don't seem to see racism and discrimination as a domestic issue in their platform. They see it as like an international human rights issue or a foreign policy issue. So, for example, it wants to establish an Office of Religious Freedom that would move towards peaceful religious coexistence. It wants to see the country's first Muslim ambassador to help engage with the world's Muslim majority nations. And it actually, acknowledges two asks from the Muslim community in the wake of that summit that we talked about. It's the only party actually to express support for the Muslim minority Uyghur population in China. And it's also committed to expanding the accessibility of the federal government's security infrastructure program, which helps protect places of worship from hate-motivated attacks. That was a big ask from the Muslim community. But yes, absolutely, domestically, many of those issues aren't raised. They don't really talk about repealing mandatory minimum sentences if we're talking about criminal justice reform. But the party does say that it wants to reduce the incarceration rates of Indigenous people.
And let's come to the NDP platform now. Is there anything that sets them apart?
So one of the things that leaders of religious minority groups wanted after those summits that we had this summer was a better handling of hate crimes. We've really seen a rise in hate crimes in terms of self-reported incidents. Those numbers are just explosive in this country. And the NDP have seized on a big ask there from communities by pledging that all major cities should have a dedicated hate crime unit in local police forces. So these are specialized people who would know how to handle and collect data on these crimes specifically. And we just talked a little bit about the Liberals' National Action Plan. The NDP have put forward, a specific plan focused on online hate. And the NDP also says that it's committed to ending the overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous people in the criminal justice system. It's proposed a task force and some other strategies around that. And finally, it also wants to see changes in police forces and the RCMP overall. So banning carding is one of their promises, so like street checks. And it's also called for a review of the budget of the RCMP, and it wants to see more accountability in police forces as well.
Some of the criticism I've heard about some of the points is that the ideas are there, the policies are there, but it's a little bit low on details. Is that sort of the case?
Yeah, so this is sort of a big problem with the NDP and their platforms is that they are vague. And if you really want the specific details on how something is going to work, you have to push for it, you have to ask for it. And, sometimes you just get more talking points. And so when we talk about forming government, we usually talk about the Liberals versus the Conservatives. But the NDP could at least stand to get more seats this time around. And so if these are issues that it wants to move forward, it will need to have a specific way of getting there.
What about the Green Party's platform? They do have some stuff on police reform, right?
Yes. So systemic racism is something that's addressed several times in the Green Party platform. Their platform kind of focuses more on data collection efforts, hate speech. It has a really interesting proposal to use artificial intelligence to detect and de-emphasize hate and violence online. And it has some similar proposals to the NDP on criminal justice reform. But on police reform specifically, it does propose to limit the RCMP and its funding. And so that's, of course, part of this defund the police movement that we saw in the wake of George Floyd's murder. And so the party specifically wants to reduce spending, reallocate those resources to community and social services, and create a more independent police oversight system.
Raisa, is the Green Party the only party that has a plan for race-based data? We did realize the importance of this and the lack of it during the pandemic. Is there political will to build on this by other parties as well, or is it just the Green Party right now?
So it's not just the Green Party. It doesn't come up in the conservative platform, and it's not really featured in the liberal platform either. But in fairness to the liberals, it was a part of this year's federal budget. They committed $172 million over 5 years to implement a disaggregated data action plan. And they've also called for bolstering data collection to better inform Canada's justice system and the RCMP. The NDP also says it will prioritize the collection of race-based data, specifically in the areas of health, employment, and policing. But the Greens, they're the ones who want to make a mandatory national database that would collect police use of force data specifically. And then that's something that would be then disaggregated further by race, ethnic background, national origin, age, etc., to better understand the extent of systemic racism in Canada.
Raisa, as we come to the conclusion of this, it's hard to talk about racism and not talk about this unprecedented wave of vitriol, this violence and protests we're seeing this election season. There's a strange symbolism in the Prime Minister being pursued on the campaign trail. What do you think this conveys about this moment in time for Canada?
I think that's a really apt way of putting it, in that it's strange and to many, racialized people, unexpected. On the one hand, you have these protests that themselves have a racist and misogynistic component. These anti-vaxxer protesters are hurling comments at racialized people and others protecting Justin Trudeau. And we've also seen this vitriol bleed into local campaigns too. So it's not just the Liberal leader. So aside from getting, election signs kicked down, which happens from time to time in every election, candidates are reporting that their signs have been vandalized with racist, sexist, transphobic, hateful content. And the combined scale of all of this really tells us that as much as racism and other forms of discrimination impacts Canadians, it also impacts the way politicians are able to campaign in this country. And so I think this shows us that hate is really baked into parts of our society. Suddenly, it's not just racialized Canadians and other people from oppressed groups facing harassment and violence. It's Justin Trudeau as well, but he's getting it in a very visceral way. And so if we take away anything from the past couple of years that we've had and this election itself, I think it's that we need to acknowledge what it's really like to live in this country and hope that political leaders understand that too, especially after September 20th.
Right. It's a problem that seems to have grown, and it's kind of hard to brush something under the carpet when it's staring you right in the face on the campaign trail.
Absolutely.
Something to think about. Thank you so much, Raisa, for this analysis and this breakdown. And I know you're going to be on the campaign trail now, so please stay safe out there.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to join you.
I was talking to Raisa Patel. She's an Ottawa-based reporter covering federal politics for The Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm your host, Sabai Tazaz. The This Matters team is Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bucknick, Raju Muther, and Sean Pattenden. Our music is by So-Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattenden. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.